What is coming will not announce itself with fire and thunder. It will not arrive as a missile streaking across the night sky, or as a naval commander standing before cameras declaring that a strait has been closed, or as another breathless bulletin from Washington announcing that negotiations have entered their final hour. It will arrive more quietly than that. It will arrive in the form of a map. A map that most people have looked at for years without understanding what it was actually showing them. A map of roads, railways, ports, pipelines, mountain corridors, desert highways, and one deepwater harbor sitting on the edge of the Arabian Sea, close enough to the Persian Gulf to matter, but far enough from the immediate fire of Hormuz to change the calculation entirely. That harbor is Gwadar. That country is Pakistan. And the power studying that map more carefully than almost anyone else is China. Pay close attention to what follows, because the real question in this crisis is not whether Iran fires another missile. It is not whether the United States sends another carrier group. It is not whether oil rises by $5, $10, or $20 in a single day. The real question is this: what happens when China decides that the route America can threaten is no longer the route China must depend on? Because if that question is answered, then the Iran crisis stops being only an Iran crisis. It becomes something larger, colder, and far more consequential. It becomes the moment when Beijing looks at Hormuz, looks at the American Navy, looks at sanctions, looks at oil markets, looks at Pakistan, and quietly concludes that the old map has become too dangerous to trust. This is not theater. This is mathematics. A modern great power does not run on speeches. It does not run on slogans. It does not run on diplomatic statements about stability, restraint, and the international order. A modern great power runs on energy. It runs on oil measured in millions of barrels per day. It runs on shipping lanes that must remain open. It runs on ports that must keep operating. It runs on insurance markets, tanker routes, naval chokepoints, payment systems, refineries, pipelines, and political relationships with countries most viewers rarely think about until a crisis forces the map onto the screen. And for China, the mathematics of this crisis are brutally simple. If the Strait of Hormuz becomes unstable, if the United States can pressure the Gulf, if sanctions can be weaponized, if the dollar system can monitor and punish energy flows, then China's problem is not simply Iran. China's problem is geography. For decades, the American advantage has not only been military power. It has been geographic power. The United States sits behind oceans, commands alliances, dominates maritime surveillance, and possesses the naval infrastructure to pressure the world's most important sea lanes. The old world order was built on that fact. Oil moved through predictable corridors. Trade moved through predictable ports. Payments moved through predictable financial channels. And Washington, more than any other capital, understood how to turn that predictability into leverage. But every empire makes the same mistake near the end of its confidence. It assumes the map cannot be redrawn. Rome assumed the roads would always serve Rome. Britain assumed the sea lanes would always serve the British Empire. The United States assumed the dollar, the navy, and the choke points would always serve the American order. China has spent years studying that assumption. And Pakistan may be the place where that assumption begins to break. The mainstream question is simple and therefore incomplete. Will Iran and America make a deal? The deeper question is much more dangerous. What has China learned from watching this crisis unfold? Because Beijing has seen something that cannot be unseen. It has seen how quickly the world's most important energy route can become a bargaining chip. It has seen how fast oil markets react when Hormuz becomes uncertain. It has seen how vulnerable every import-dependent economy becomes when a narrow waterway begins to dictate the cost of survival. And most importantly, China has seen that the American response to every crisis is still built around the same instinct: pressure the sea, pressure the dollar, pressure the choke point, pressure the rival until the rival's choices narrow. That instinct is exactly why Pakistan matters. Not emotionally, not symbolically, not as a slogan about friendship, operationally. Pakistan gives China something Iran alone cannot give it. It gives China land access toward the Arabian Sea. It gives China a strategic corridor pointed at the Indian Ocean. It gives China a way to imagine energy and trade movement that does not depend entirely on the routes America has spent generations learning how to monitor, threaten, and, if necessary, interrupt. This is why the phrase China-Pakistan economic corridor is too soft for what is actually at stake. A corridor sounds like infrastructure. What China needs is not merely infrastructure. It needs optionality. It needs a second map. It needs a route that turns a naval problem into a continental problem. It needs a port that complicates blockade planning. It needs roads and railways that can move selected strategic goods inland. It needs an energy and logistics architecture that tells Washington one thing very clearly: you can threaten the sea, but you can no longer assume the sea is the only board. This is the hidden meaning of Pakistan and the Iran crisis. Iran creates the pressure. Pakistan creates the answer. Now understand the operational logic step by step. Phase 1 is not a military phase. It is a perception phase. During a crisis, markets do not wait for certainty. They move on fear. Oil traders watch Hormuz. Shipping companies watch insurance rates. Governments watch reserves. Central banks watch inflation. Every headline about US-Iran talks, every threat of closure, every report of disrupted shipping or delayed passage sends a signal through the world economy. And China, unlike smaller powers, does not merely react to that signal. It studies it. It asks, how many days can our refineries operate under import pressure? How much crude can be drawn from stockpiles? Which suppliers become more important if Gulf routes tighten? Which land corridors become strategic rather than symbolic? Which partner becomes indispensable if the sea becomes uncertain? This is where Pakistan enters the equation, because the crisis reveals not just a battlefield, but a weakness in the architecture of globalization itself. Too much energy moves through narrow spaces. Too much commerce depends on rules enforced by powers that are no longer neutral. Too much financial settlement passes through systems that can be politicized in an instant. And so China's answer is not one dramatic announcement. It is accumulation, a road upgraded here, a port deepened there, a pipeline proposal revived, a railway discussion reopened, a security agreement strengthened, a customs process simplified, a naval understanding expanded, a port city protected more carefully, a corridor no longer described as economic but understood as strategic. The silence is the signal. Phase 2 is the logistics phase. This is where most commentators fail, because they speak about countries as if they are characters in a drama rather than systems that consume material. A nation's strategy is not only what its leaders say, it is what its supply chains permit. China imports enormous quantities of energy. Its industry, transport system, military production, petrochemical sector, and domestic stability all depend on the assumption that energy remains available at tolerable prices. When the Gulf becomes unstable, Beijing cannot simply issue a statement and hope geography changes. It must build around the danger. Pakistan's value is that it sits at the edge of that danger, but also beyond its narrowest point. Gwadar faces the Arabian Sea. It does not solve every problem. It does not replace all maritime imports. It does not magically turn geography into safety. But strategy is rarely about perfect solutions. It is about reducing dependence on a single failure point. If even a portion of strategic movement can be diversified, if even some emergency flows can be rerouted, if even one additional pressure valve exists outside the immediate Hormuz trap, then the entire calculation changes. America's leverage depends on predictability. China's counter-leverage depends on alternatives. This is why Pakistan is not a side story. It is a pressure valve in a world where choke points are becoming weapons. Phase 3 is the financial phase, and this is where the story moves from ports to the petrodollar. For decades, oil and the dollar have been tied together not only by economics but by power. The system gave Washington extraordinary influence. Energy flows, reserve currency status, sanctions, banking access, maritime insurance, and security guarantees formed one large machine. But every machine has stress points. When the Middle East burns, when Hormuz becomes unstable, when sanctions multiply, when oil markets jump, countries begin asking dangerous questions. Why should one country's financial system decide who can buy energy? Why should one navy's position near one strait determine the inflation rate of half the world? Why should trade between Asian powers remain dependent on a political architecture built after a different century's wars? This does not mean the dollar collapses overnight. Serious analysis does not require fantasy. Systems this large do not vanish in a single news cycle, but they do erode. They erode when countries build alternatives. They erode when payment systems diversify. They erode when China buys discounted energy outside the preferred channels. They erode when Asian trade becomes more regional. They erode when Pakistan becomes not just a recipient of investment, but a strategic bridge between China, the Gulf, Iran, and the Indian Ocean. This is the part Washington does not want to discuss plainly. Because the most dangerous attack on a financial empire is not always a formal declaration of war against its currency. Sometimes it is a road, sometimes it is a port, sometimes it is a corridor that gives other countries the confidence to imagine a world where the old system is still powerful, but no longer unavoidable. And once unavoidable becomes optional, the empire has already entered a different stage of history. Now let us address the obvious objection. Pakistan is unstable. Pakistan has debt problems. Pakistan has security problems. Pakistan has political problems. Gwadar has faced delays, local resistance, infrastructure gaps, and protection challenges. CPEC has not fulfilled every promise made about it. None of this should be ignored. But this objection misses the strategic point. China does not need Pakistan to be perfect. China needs Pakistan to be useful. There is a difference. Perfect allies are rare. Useful geography is priceless. The British Empire did not control every local dynamic in every port it used. The United States did not build its global military system only in places without political risk. Russia does not require every partner to be stable before using the relationship strategically. Great powers do not choose from ideal maps. They choose from available maps, and Pakistan is available in a way few countries are. It borders China. It connects toward the Arabian Sea. It sits near Iran. It watches India. It offers strategic depth against U.S. maritime pressure. It provides Beijing with a long-term answer to a question that every Chinese planner must now ask more urgently. What happens if the sea turns against us? This is why the competitor videos around Xi and Pakistan are performing so strongly. The audience senses that Pakistan is not being discussed because of Pakistan alone. Pakistan is being discussed because it changes the China story. And the China story is the real story. Iran is the crisis. Pakistan is the answer. America is the pressure. The dollar is the system. Hormuz is the choke point. And China is the power trying to make sure that no single choke point can decide its future. If this kind of serious geopolitical analysis is what you come here for, not comfortable fiction, not recycled headlines, but the deeper structure beneath the crisis, then subscribe now, because the next phase of this story will not be understood by those watching only the missiles. It will be understood by those watching the roots. Now let us move to the question Washington should be asking. What can America do if China's response to pressure is not escalation, but rerouting? Military power is excellent at destroying targets. It is less effective at destroying incentives. The United States can pressure Iran. It can sanction companies. It can move ships. It can threaten costs. It can reassure allies. It can speak of deterrence. But it cannot easily force China to forget what this crisis has taught it. Once a great power sees vulnerability in its supply chain, it does not unsee it. Once it identifies a route that might reduce that vulnerability, it does not abandon it because diplomats issue statements. Once it recognizes that a partner like Pakistan can serve as a strategic hinge, it begins thinking in decades, not news cycles. This is the difference between Washington's crisis rhythm and Beijing's infrastructure rhythm. Washington moves in announcements. Beijing moves in accumulation. Washington asks what happens this week. Beijing asks what route will matter in 2035. Washington sees a negotiation. Beijing sees a map. And in that difference lies the entire danger for the old order. Because if the United States treats Iran as the center of the crisis, while China treats Iran as the warning signal, then the two powers are not even playing the same game. One is reacting to fire. The other is building around smoke. The visible war is missiles. The invisible war is supply. The visible crisis is Hormuz. The invisible answer may be Pakistan. And the visible debate is whether oil prices rise this month. The invisible debate is whether the world's second largest economy is quietly preparing for a future in which American-controlled routes no longer hold the same power. Capability is not inevitability. Pakistan does not automatically become China's perfect escape route. Gwadar does not instantly neutralize the U.S. Navy. CPEC does not erase the complexity of geography, politics, mountains, security, and finance. But history teaches that capabilities carefully built do not disappear. They wait. They wait for the crisis that makes them necessary. They wait for the moment when the old route becomes too dangerous, too expensive, or too politically exposed. They wait for the moment when a leader looks at the map and says, "We cannot depend on that path alone anymore." And that is why Israel, America, and the broader Western system should pay attention not only to what Iran does next, but to what China builds next. Because the crisis may end, the ceasefire may hold, oil prices may fall, diplomats may smile for cameras, markets may calm, analysts may declare that the worst has passed. But the lesson will remain. China has seen the vulnerability, Pakistan has seen the opportunity, Iran has revealed the pressure point, and the world order has been reminded that the most powerful weapon in a crisis is not always the missile. Sometimes it is the route that survives after the missile stops flying. So the real question is not whether Iran's crisis ends this week. The real question is whether China has already begun building the world that comes after it. What do you think? Is Pakistan becoming China's strategic answer to the Iran-Hormuz crisis, or is this another overhyped corridor that will never become what Beijing needs it to be? Write your view in the comments. Because this debate is not about one port, one war, or one headline. It is about whether the old map still controls the future, or whether China has quietly started drawing a new one.